Good evening, everyone. My name is Ware Harmon, and I'm the Executive Director of Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of our organization and our partners at the Elliott Bay Book Company, it's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's live stream conversation between Susan Glasser and Peter Baker in conversation with Rajiv Chandrasekaran. As we gather, as we get underway tonight, I want to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, and particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. And we thank you all for tuning in. Town Hall is sincerely grateful for the opportunity to invite Seattle audiences and beyond into present tense exchanges of issues, ideas, and creativity, even when we don't get to do it in person. Town Hall will continue to produce online content throughout this fall and into the new year, and as circumstances allow, to even host live streams from our building. Meanwhile, if like me, you just can't log quite enough hours on Zoom or YouTube, know that many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form under the header Digital Media. But back to tonight's program. Our guests will talk for about 35-40 minutes, after which they'll take questions together from the Ask a Question field at the bottom center of your screen. Please keep your own question concise, and they'll get to as many as possible. Also, know that you can view the event either here on Crowdcast or over on our YouTube page if you want to utilize that platform's closed captioning feature. But it is easier for us if you pose your questions back over here if possible. At any rate, Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming programs include a panel discussion moderated by Joni Balter, posing the question, has Seattle become, as well as upcoming appearances by Mario Livio, Marion Nessel, Michael Eric Dyson, Roger Rosenblatt, Robert Putnam, Andre Gregory, and still more programs from the 2020 Earshot Jazz Festival offered live from our forum space. For more information about all of the above, visit townhallseattle.org. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our civics programs in particular are supported by the Real Networks Foundation, the True Brown Foundation, KUOW, and the Wyncote Foundation Northwest. But as most of you know, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, first and foremost, and I'd like to thank all of our members watching tonight. We truly wouldn't be here without your support. As for one last piece of infomercial, it goes without saying that our partner booksellers are feeling the effects of the pandemic as well. If you want to go deeper into tonight's issue, into the issues in tonight's discussion, especially in this pivotal moment, hope you will consider purchasing your copy of the book here tonight from our partners at Elliott Bay Book Company. More than ever, it's important to keep it local. All right, then. Susan Glasser is a staff writer for The New Yorker and author of its weekly column, Letter from Trump's Washington. She is a former editor of Politico and the founding editor of Politico magazine. As a host of the podcast, The Global Politico, which won Best Political Podcast of the Year in 2017 from Quartz, she has interviewed important leaders from former British Prime Minister Tony Blair to MSNBC host Andrea Mitchell to former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. Her work in D.C. has also included work as editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy, editor of Outlook and National News at The Washington Post, and editor at Roll Call, a Capitol Hill newspaper. Currently, Glasser also serves as a CNN global affairs analyst. Peter Baker is the chief White House correspondent for The New York Times, in charge of covering President Trump. He previously covered the Obama White House for The Times as well, and covered Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush for The Washington Post, where he worked for 20 years. Baker is also a political analyst for MSNBC and the author of 5 previous titles, including The Breach, Inside the Impeachment and Trial of William Jefferson Clinton, published in 2000, and Days of Fire, Bush and Cheney in the White House, published in 2013. Rajiv Chandrasekaran is a senior correspondent and associate editor at The Washington Post, previously serving as the paper's national editor and as bureau chief in Baghdad, Cairo, and Southeast Asia. He is the author of Little America, The War Within the War for Afghanistan, and the award-winning Imperial Life in the Emerald City, an account of the troubled American effort to reconstruct Iraq. Peter and Susan's first assignment as a married couple was as Moscow bureau chiefs for The Washington Post, which resulted in their first co-authored work, Kremlin Rising, Vladimir Putin's Russia and the End of Revolution, which was published in 2005. And they're currently working on an account of the Trump administration, whenever that might end. And while they certainly have perspectives to share on both topics tonight, and that's your cue for a Q&A question, they are with us to discuss their just released work, The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III. Please join me in welcoming Rajiv Chandrasekaran, Peter Baker, and Susan Glasser.
Thank you, Ware, for that kind introduction. One thing just to add at the outset, I'm formerly the Washington Post, but currently now a resident of Seattle, Washington. And one other just a caveat to say at the outset, I've learned an awful lot about journalism, my 21 years in the profession, from Peter and Susan, who are, I dare say, the two most preeminent print journalists in DC today. The work that they produce on a nearly daily basis for the Times and the New Yorker is without par. These two have been covering the city for 3 decades now, and it's just been
that just makes us old.
A privilege to call them friends, and the work they do is phenomenal. And they've written this amazing new book here, which I'll hold up, "The Man Who Ran Washington," a seminal biography of former Secretary of State, former Treasury Secretary, former White House Chief of Staff James A. Baker III. Let me describe the book for all of you in a couple of lines, and then turn it over to some questions for the two of them. A phenomenal journalist who's covered Washington for many, many years, Jim Mann, described the book this way in the Washington Post. He's called it among the very best books about American political life in the 20th century. This book is about Jim Baker, who operated at the center of events in Washington for more than 25 years. That's longer than the term of many presidents. He served as Reagan's White House Chief of Staff and then as Treasury Secretary. He was George H.W. Bush's Secretary of State when he helped the U.S. navigate the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the reunification of Germany, as well as the first Persian Gulf War. And then after all that, he returned to serve as Chief of Staff to President George H.W. Bush in 1992. In the first couple of pages of this book, Tom Donilon, who served as a national security advisor to President Barack Obama, Peter and Susan quote him, calling Baker the most important unelected official since World War II. The book, for in many of its pages, takes us back to a different time in Washington, which we'll talk a little bit about tonight, to a time when bipartisan solutions to big problems were possible, when policy could be forged through thoughtful compromise, and where people on both sides were willing to recognize the power of ideas and the humanity in their opponents. In a review in the New York Times, Samantha Power notes that the former Secretary of State's experience as a public servant offered timeless lessons in how to use personal relationships, broad-based coalitions, and tireless negotiating to advance U.S. interests. This is simply a tour de force, but I'd like to begin, Peter and Susan, with the early years of Jim Baker. We'll move quickly through many years and a really remarkable career in service of our country. But here's a man who grew up in wealth and privilege in Houston, Texas, where he met on the tennis courts there a man who would go on to be president of the United States, George H.W. Bush. Unlike Bush, he was a multi-generational Houstonian. His family was part of the city's original aristocracy. But take us to both his early days, but help us understand quickly how his friendship with Bush blossomed to the point where Bush was able to get Baker to change his party affiliation and eventually come to run a political campaign that launched him on this remarkable career in Washington.
Well, thank you, Rajiv. It's so great to be with you and with everyone in Seattle. I have to say that is maybe the one unintended positive of this Zoom book tour, which has consisted of us sitting in our living room as we were doing right now. So thank you again to everyone. We're staying up here late on the East Coast to talk with you. The thing is that you're right, that the story of Jim Baker and the story of George Herbert Walker Bush obviously are so intertwined. And I don't know about you, but I'm definitely someone who loves reading biographies, political biographies, but I tend to like the first part of the book the best, because that's the stuff I don't know. And that certainly proved to be the case in doing this book and writing this book as well. And, Baker's early story, I think, came to me as really quite a surprise, given that, we're so familiar with this dazzling resume. And, Peter and I certainly set out with the intention of writing a book about power and Washington, since he dominated it so much from the end of Watergate to the end of the Cold War. And yet I found myself drawn to trying to understand how he became essentially an accidental indispensable man in Washington. Jim Baker didn't even get to Washington until he was 45 years old. In many ways, he was sort of the most successful mid-career switch ever. And so that Houston part of the story really, and the family part of the story, is a very outsized part of it. Baker, it meant something very big in Houston to be a Baker of the Jim Baker line. And the family motto was really stay out of politics, which is interesting. And so in a funny way, I think we came to realize that for Jim Baker to go to Washington and to have this career was really an act of rebellion in some ways against this very privileged, but also, constrained and duty-bound first few decades that he had lived. And I don't think any of it would have happened had he not become doubles partners with George Herbert Walker Bush. And by the way, I'm sure we'll talk about this more. One thing I would say about that is that these are two hyper-competitive men. And the reason that George Bush ended up wanting to be Jim Baker's tennis partner is because Jim Baker was already the singles champion at the Houston Country Club. And, his name, Baker showed it to us, his name was right there on the wall at the Country Club for George Bush to see as he joined this new world in Houston.
He was not only did he sort of come from patrician roots, he was a very private man. To the point, I was stunned that when his first wife was dying of cancer, he didn't even tell his young children that their mom was ill. He kept it a secret from everybody. I'd like you to talk a little bit about that moment, what it says about him, but it leads me into sort of a bigger question about all of this, which is, how did you get him to open up so? You spent dozens of hours with him. He gave you a level of access that he's given nobody else. In fact, earlier attempts at writing biographies of him, at least one, frustrated the biographer. How did you open up this man who was such a deeply private person in so many ways?
Well, it's a great question. Look, you're right. That was a tragic story with his wife is dying of cancer. It's a moment. It's a mark of the moment, I think, in some ways. Sort of a Mad Men era where men didn't talk about their feelings and didn't disclose secrets, and he was a private person to begin with. And he thought that if he didn't tell his children, and if he didn't even talk about it with his wife or his mother, that he could make her last months better. But the one person he did confide in was George Bush, which I think tells you a lot about that relationship that Susan was talking about. I think if the one person in the world you share this most painful secret, the idea that your wife is going to die, is your best friend. And I think that suggests why their tandem in politics for the next several decades is so different than any other, right? This is a president and secretary of state who weren't just political allies or political rivals, as some of them are. They were personal friends in a real way long before politics. So how do we get him to open up a little bit? I think by this point in his life, we approached him in 2013. He was 83 at the time. He had written 2 memoirs of his own. He's not an introspective guy. He's not let's sit on the couch and I'm going to let you, explore my attic of psychological thinking. But I do think that he was ready for somebody else to write a biography of him. I think he's a canny enough guy to know that if you really are going to be a significant figure in history, somebody else has to write about you independent of you. It can't just be your own memoir. So I think, he understood that. He welcomed the fact that we were interested in doing it. And he did open up. He opened up all of his archives at Princeton and Rice University. He sat with us as many times as we asked. Some of the most interesting and most important interviews, though, of course, were with his wife, Susan, who's fabulous, his 8 children, his cousin, who was like a brother to him, since passed away. We interviewed his nanny, who is still with us today at 107. And so I thought that, exploring this part of him that people hadn't seen made it one of the most interesting parts of the book.
Just going back to his friendship with Bush for a second, there's that old saw about Washington that if you want a friend in D.C., get a dog. Can you think of another president who had such a close, trusted advisor as Bush did with Baker? I mean, was that in some ways in our modern era somewhat singular?
I think it is, absolutely. Peter and I have a long-running argument about whether Jefferson and Madison are a comparable tandem, although I guess the general consensus among historians is no, because Madison was really so much junior to Jefferson, was really much more of an acolyte than he was a peer. And Baker and Bush were absolutely peers. It's interesting because actually Baker told us that when he first met Bush, it's hard because we remember everything that happened afterwards, but remember at the time, Bush is a little bit older than Baker. He was a war hero in World War II. He was the youngest naval aviator. Baker was younger and had not served in the war, had been in the Marines, but only after World War II. Baker had never really yet broken away from the constraints of his family, whereas Bush, his father at that time, was the very imperious Prescott Bush, a senator from Connecticut. But Bush had tried to strike out on his own, gone to Texas to make his way. He had been elected to the House of Representatives. And so, for Baker, the word he used was dazzling. He said he was kind of like an older brother to me, but he was a little dazzled by him. That power dynamic shifted over time. And certainly by the time you get to the Reagan era, when Baker is chief of staff and Bush is vice president, it's really a very different kind of relationship, because in fact, in a day-to-day sense, although vice president is the grander sounding title and is a constitutional officer, in a practical sense, it was Jim Baker who was running Washington in the first few years of the Reagan presidency. And of course, by the time Bush became president, Baker had so much stature that there was often talk, and Bush often resented it to a certain extent, that Baker was so widely portrayed as the canny man behind the scenes who was really running the show. And he would often express his peevishness to Baker if Baker pushed him too hard, and he would say, well, if you're so smart, how come you're not president? And Baker told us that was when he knew it was time to back off.
To a point, even in those early years as Reagan's chief of staff, right? People referred to him as kind of Reagan's co-president, given his power. Before we get there, though, this is a man who's had this remarkable career in Washington. Two cabinet secretary jobs, two of the most important jobs. All this time in the White House as chief of staff for two presidents. So somebody who's had a role in at the highest levels of domestic policy, foreign policy, fiscal policy, over a quarter century. Help us understand what was his philosophy coming in? Well, you think back with this remove of time, right? You think, okay, here's the man who stewarded us through the end of the Cold War. Was he a foreign policy realist? What was his approach to the world? What was his approach to government? Was he a small government guy? Was he a big government guy? He sort of begs this question, given all that in his career, and what you've learned, do ideas and philosophy matter less than the ability to move the machinery of politics, to get stuff done in Washington, to operate the levers of power? What does Baker's career tell us about sort of coming in with vision and philosophy versus just the ability to do things and be political?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it goes to the heart in some ways of his time in public office. Look, he wasn't Kissinger. He wasn't a geopolitical thinker or a strategist. He wasn't a big reader of political treatises. He didn't teach in an academic setting. He wouldn't give you a disquisition on the Treaty of Westphalia and the modern nation state. It just wasn't his thing. He was a guy who got stuff done. Now, was he a conservative? Yes. He is a small C conservative. Not in the revolutionary sense that the Gingrich revolutionaries were, or even the Reagan revolutionaries. His idea of conservatism was stability, order, preserving the best of America, traditionalism, but not a crusading kind. So, in some ways he was, not the author of great change, but the channeler of great change, right? So he comes along and it's Reagan who starts a revolution, but it's Baker who channels it and harnesses it and puts it into action in the form of legislation, in the form of policy, in the form of a re-election. Baker's not the one who pulls down the Berlin Wall or collapses the Soviet Union, but he channels these great forces of history that are happening on his watch to bring it into a relatively safe landing, which is not inevitable. So I think Baker would not be a thinker or a philosopher. He would be a doer. And I think in today's Washington, that's kind of a rare thing.
So let's talk about his first. He did have time working for President Ford, but he comes to Washington with George H.W. Bush and quickly sort of moves from H.W. to serve, beats out Ed Meese and a few others to this coveted job as chief of staff to Reagan in 1980. When you think about chiefs of staff, they're kind of different models, but you have, let's say, the pugilistic in guys like Mark Meadows and Rahm. You have others that are sort of cast as somewhat ineffective bureaucrats. When you think back to the Reagan era, of course, some of this with the passage of time, this former governor of California sweeping in and, those kind of the creation of the myth of Reagan. What was Baker's role in that? But what made him so effective in that job? I mean, he's widely viewed as one of the most effective. I mean, the modern White House chief of staff is only a construct, I guess, since the Kennedy years. Eisenhower. So not that long. It doesn't go back to Madison. But what made Baker so effective in that job?
I do think you're right, Rajiv, that he's really widely considered to be the gold standard, more or less, for chief of staff. And certainly that's one of the reasons that Democrats as well as Republicans are very interested in this project. As Peter and I were working on it these last few years, everybody wants to know what's the secret, of Baker's success. How did he wire Washington? The story of how he sort of vanquished Ed Meese, I think, is worth noting in that sense, right? So Baker is not a Reagan insider. In fact, he's run not one, but two national campaigns against Ronald Reagan, and yet is still basically brought in to become his chief of staff. Now, this wasn't Ronald Reagan's idea. It was actually two of his advisors, Stuart Spencer and Michael Deaver. They both claim authorship of this, which suggests how successful it was. But essentially, they teamed up. And even before the election in 1980, they were scheming to get Baker in front of Ronald Reagan for some FaceTime and to, sort of make this happen. Reagan agrees to it, but he says, all right, well, you're going to have to sit down and work it out with Ed Meese, who had expected to get the job and who had, in fact, been his chief of staff back in California when Reagan was governor. But Meese was seen as an administrative managerial disaster. His briefcase was the place where papers go to die. Right. And so amazingly, Reagan was sort of famous for not wanting to be confrontational. Right. And essentially dumps this problem on Baker's lap as his very first assignment is like, make nice with Ed. So the two of them sit down. Baker, is nothing if not a very careful corporate lawyer, famous for always fanatic preparation, for, carrying legal pads with him everywhere and writing notes down about everything. He says to Meese, well, we're going to just divide up our spheres of responsibility. And, he understands immediately that Meese is looking for status, for prestige. He says, great, why don't you take the cabinet rank? Why don't you take the fancy title? Sure, you can have Henry Kissinger's office. Meanwhile, I'll just do, some of these unsexy things like communications and legislative affairs. And, oh, yes, I'll handle the staff secretary and just the paperwork flow to and from the president's office. All those unglamorous things. Oh, personnel. Yeah, I'll do personnel too. Well, of course, titles mean nothing in Washington. Cabinet status means basically nothing in Washington. What means everything in Washington is controlling the access of information to and from the president, controlling who gets what job, and of course, controlling Congress and the legislative shop meant that any part of the policy agenda that was going to get enacted was going to have to go through Jim Baker. So I love that story because I think it tells you that he was a man who understood from the very beginning that the levers of power are not necessarily obvious. And, Mies essentially was the agent of his own disempowerment there. Someone said to us every single day that Jim Baker was in the Reagan White House, he gained power and his rivals lost it.
How did he come? That's fascinating. How did he come to learn that, as such a newcomer to Washington? Others, you say, oh, he was there as an intern and he learned it from so-and-so, or, you could look back to key figures in the George W. Bush White House, for instance, that you've chronicled, Peter, and you can see where they who are their mentors along the way. How did Baker become so wily as a newcomer to the city?
Well, it's a great question because, in fact, he really had spent very little time in federal government service when Reagan picks him. And Reagan picks him because he's the Washington insider. Well, his time in Washington consisted of about a year at the Commerce Department and, and one campaign, that is Ford's campaign, which he did, pretty well at. I think more than an experience, it's just a sign of instinct and an intuition. He had an instinct intuition for how to make things work, how to get other people to do what you want them to do without making them resent it, or at least to minimize sometimes the resentment. Doesn't mean he always succeeded at that. He had plenty of enemies in Washington, of course, but I think he had a skill that meant that he could figure out what the person on the other side of the table needed in order to walk away feeling successful. And it was often something he didn't mind giving away, something that didn't cost him anything, like giving Ed Meese cabinet rank. Who cares? And he did that with the Democrats on the Hill. He did that with the Soviets over the arms control table. He did that with the Germans in reunifying Germany. He did that with the Israelis and the Arabs and bringing them together for the Madrid Peace Conference. He figured out what each side needed. He figured out where their red lines were, where they couldn't cross. He didn't try to push people to do things that they couldn't do. And then he found ways to make them happy while getting what he wanted.
Speaking of that, one really sort of powerful story you guys lay out in this book, in the part where he is serving as Secretary of the Treasury, was 1986, the landmark Tax Reform Act under President Reagan. It feels like an eon ago, yeah. But what I took from it, beyond this great sort of inside Washington story you paint in such vivid detail, was fundamentally, this involved a Republican president and his Republican Treasury Secretary finding accommodation with the very powerful chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, Dan Rostenkowski, before he would be sent off to prison, I guess, when he was still, large stakes at Morton's in Georgetown with lobbyists. But how Baker managed to forge, it felt like you'd been transported to this bygone era where you had a landmark piece of legislation fundamentally altering the U.S. tax code in a very profound way that both sides were able to negotiate over, go back and forth on, and it wasn't one side jamming the other and passing with just the support of one party. This thing had broad bipartisan support in both houses of Congress. And so let's get back in the time machine and take us back for a moment to how, because, we think about this today. It sounds like, people speaking ancient Lithuanian. So how did this happen? And maybe in so telling, are there any lessons for today, or maybe not today, but for next year?
Well, look, one part of the story obviously is that if you wanted to get anything, literally anything done in the Reagan era or the first Bush term, you had to work with Democrats because Democrats controlled the House of Representatives the entire time and they controlled the Senate for part of the time. And the bottom line is that actually it was easier in some ways for Jim Baker to negotiate with Dan Rostenkowski than it was for him to work with Bob Packwood, the Republican chairman of the Finance Committee. So, this was remarkably, though, this was really Ronald Reagan's the most important agenda item for Reagan's second term, right? It was the big legislative delivery, and it was the big thing that they ultimately did before Iran-Contra swamped, the rest of the agenda for the second term. And, and yet Rostenkowski and the Democrats were also heavily invested in it because they saw that as their own legacy building as well. So each side thought that there was political benefit in doing the deal. I think that's a key thing to take away from it. But, look, Baker was a big believer in taking on even non-obvious challenges if he thought that it was hard but doable. And he was willing to jettison much more ideological versions of tax reform, including there was a first crack by the Treasury Department under his predecessor, Don Reagan, with whom he famously switched jobs, and Reagan became the White House chief of staff and Baker became the Treasury Secretary. Baker got into the Treasury Department and realized that the proposal they were working with was a political non-starter. And I do think that that's one of the things. We talked a bit about his success in the Reagan administration and chief of staff. Part of his success was knowing which parts of the Reagan Revolution were actually possible. And so, it did matter to have somebody who was much more pragmatic and less ideological in that role, I would say, under Baker, because there were a lot of aspects of the Reagan Revolution that were rhetorical, that weren't going to fly. Jim Baker wasn't a culture warrior. He wasn't interested in that aspect of the Reagan Revolution, and he made as sure as he could that they didn't pursue it. He wasn't interested in things like eliminating the education department, which is something that Reagan had run on in 1980. But Baker said, forget it. This is never going to go anywhere. Congress won't agree to it. So by the time he gets to the Treasury Department, the other thing that he did, and we haven't talked as much about it, but it is a part of his success. Uber competence should not be overrated, especially when you ask about, here we are from the vantage point of 3 decades later, a little competence, could go a long way in Washington today. And hyper preparation. This is a man who knew his brief. And indefatigable legwork. The asset that Baker had at this point as Treasury Secretary was he had worked Capitol Hill for Reagan's economic program, for the Social Security deal. He understood, I think, the Hill and what motivated members of Congress at that point in time far more than probably any other member of the Reagan administration at a senior level. And that was indispensable to getting this done. He literally set up camp on the Hill. He was there all the time.
It probably also helped that his boss, President Reagan, was willing to break bread with Rostenkowski's boss, Tip O'Neill. And there was at least a willingness to engage across both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, the likes of which there really aren't today. I will say that as I was reading this section of the book late last week, I wanted to, somehow send the relevant pages to both Mnuchin and Pelosi, who still today, in a moment of much greater national crisis than we faced in '86, can't agree on the basic terms of a stimulus deal. But let's move forward in time by a few years, shall we, to let's say the dawning of the next decade in the early '90s and the fall of the Soviet Union, because you paint an incredibly rich and vivid history in this book. And, there's so much with the passage of time that we take for granted about the unification of Germany, the dissolution of the Soviet bloc. What was Baker's most critical contribution to getting this right? And without him helming this for the United States, do you think the result would have been the same?
Yeah, I think you're right on the money to ask this, because this is in fact the heart of our book in some ways, is how much is it man, how much is it moment, right? Baker, as we said, didn't break down the wall, but in fact, he and Bush were slow at first to recognize that even once the wall came down, that the Germanys were suddenly rushing to move toward unification. They still thought it might be years away. But once they picked up on that, once they sensed that, once they understood the dynamics, what you saw was Baker rush in front of the parade, they didn't lead it, and then try to get it to a place where it made sense. And it wasn't inevitable. This could have gone in a very different way. It was a complicated negotiation, as Susan said, I think with lots of different dynamics, the Soviets, the Brits who didn't want it, the French who didn't want it, 2 different Germanys, 2 different parties within West Germany. He had to navigate that. So it was a complicated, many balls in the air kind of negotiation. But think about how quickly world changed after the wall came down. Just 10 months after the wall comes down, Saddam Hussein invades Iraq. And suddenly the world is distracted by a completely different crisis. And only a few months really after that, you see the hardliners in Moscow try to take down Mikhail Gorbachev, which of course changes the whole nature of the equation of whether Germany could be free, given that there are 300,000 Soviet troops on East German territory. So had Baker not moved quickly, had he not brought people together in that moment when the opportunity presented itself, it's very likely it might not have happened, or at least might not have happened as smoothly as it did. So I do think it matters, the individual, even if he was not the author of the great forces of history in that moment.
I'll come back to Baker as a coalition builder in a second. I want to move forward in time, though, and even further now to the dawn of the new millennium and the disputed 2000 election. This was a fantastic kind of moment back in time, particularly as we're on the cusp of another presidential election. So when Florida hangs in the balance, Jim Baker goes to Florida for George W. Bush, and he assembles this legal team. And when I read these names, so he assembles this all-star legal team. Like, okay, so who's on this thing? Ted Cruz, Brett Kavanaugh, John Roberts,
Amy Coney Barrett, by the way.
Right.
She's not in the book because that was before she was nominated, but she was also there.
Seriously.
Yeah.
John Bolton, Josh Bolton, all kinds of people. Anyway.
And Baker's mission, as you guys write, was to stop the counting. Take us back into this period, and I'd like you in that to also, spin the clock forward a little bit. If what may be lessons from what Baker did that may be used in a potential Republican playbook if there are election disputes at the state level this year?
Well, look, one thing, I think we're already seeing that playbook to a certain extent. One thing that Baker was very clear on was don't let ideology get in the way of winning. And in this case, don't let your ideology about federalism and the desire of state courts to reign supreme to overcome any reluctance you might have to go into the federal courts. And there was some debate on this sort of all-star Republican legal team, since they had been so public proponents of states' rights in so many other contexts. But Baker made it clear that he thought that they did not have as good of a chance to win in the Florida state courts, given that the Florida Supreme Court at that time was entirely made up of Democratic appointed justices. So he was the one who pushed for it to be into the federal courts. You see that already happening tonight as we're speaking. Not only was Amy Coney Barrett sworn in as Justice of the Supreme Court in the most rushed and closest to an election confirmation ever, but the Supreme Court, even without her, issued a ruling. Brett Kavanaugh issued a decision tonight, essentially jumping right into the Wisconsin dispute over how to count election ballots, and Justice Kavanaugh, writing for the majority in that Wisconsin case, already said basically, well, we don't really think that they should keep accepting ballots after election night because that would somehow interfere with the results, except that never mind that the Wisconsin legislature has in fact said that it won't allow the absentee ballots to be counted before election day. So there's not going to be a result no matter what in Wisconsin. It's a very contorted ruling, but it shows that Republicans are not hesitant to go to the Supreme Court if necessary and go into the federal courts with these election disputes. So, Jim Baker, he was just basically there not to make any kind of point except that my guy won and I'm here to represent him. Now, he didn't write the very disputed 5-4 Supreme Court decision that ultimately was the Bush v. Gore ruling, right? But I do think that he stands for a certain kind of no holds barred approach to post-election legal disputes that has a lot of people very worried going into whatever we're facing next week.
Did going to courts to settle a election dispute trouble him?
No, I don't think it did.
Not at all.
I don't think it did. But look, it didn't bother the Democrats either. They were also going to court. I mean, in fact, they were the first ones to go to court in that case. It was a bipartisan thing. Both parties were looking for ways to win in any legal argument they could make that satisfied them, right? So on the hanging Chad ballots, remember those? The Republicans were arguing for a strict interpretation of the law. Don't count those ones that had only partially punched through. We should just only do what the law says. But when it came to military ballots, which they thought were more favorable to Bush,
count them all.
Yeah, count them all, whether they have postmarks or whether they're fit, the signature is right or whatever. Opposite the other way around. Democrats said we shouldn't count those military ballots if they weren't, following the letter of the law, but we should count these ballots here, even if they had a Chad stinging. So every party was trying to make whatever argument they felt they could. Here's the difference, though, Rajiv, I think, between then and now. Then and now, both sides fought it out tooth and nail within the system. And it was hard fought, and there were winners and losers, and people were upset and disappointed. But in the end, it was within the system. And in the end, people respected the system. You had in Gore, and you had in Bush, and you had in Baker, people who were creatures of American democracy and believed in it. So when it was over, Gore gave a very gracious concession speech and said, okay, now it's over. We move on. But Bush gives a very gracious victory speech and says, I'm now president for Democrats as well as Republicans. What is different today is you have a president, even before the vote has taken place, saying it is corrupt and rigged unless he wins. And that any outcome other than his own victory is automatically suspect, which is tearing at the credibility of the system in a way that could be very, very, could have a lot of impact in the days and weeks to come.
Yeah, and by the way, imagine that you have not just one Florida, but multiple Floridas all at the same time. What if the results from more than one state are challenged by the Trump campaign? You guys can't sleep enough on the West Coast here, because this is what we're thinking about here on the East Coast.
Indeed, and so it's the Full Employment Act for election lawyers around the country.
Yeah.
I just want to say a brief note to the audience. We have about 15 minutes left, so feel free to pipe in with questions in the using your question function, and I will direct them to Peter and Susan. But when you talk about how the current incumbent of the Oval Office speaks about the election, and in a very different way than, for instance, George W. Bush spoke about it, or quite frankly, any other occupant of the Oval Office. And in the beginning of the book, you write, so it would beg the question, boy, a guy like Donald Trump must make Jim Baker's skin crawl. Anathema to what I believe in, what my party should believe in. And you write, you write in your prologue, because you were interviewing Baker. One of your interviews with Baker was before the 2016 election, and the subject of Trump comes up with Baker, and you write, voting against Trump should have been an easy call for Baker. Trump, after all, was quote, a guy who's his own worst enemy, as Baker reminded us. Quote, he can't keep his mouth shut. But Baker was also not quite ready to walk away from the party to which he had devoted so many years. So you open the book with that. We know that unlike perhaps other members of the Bush family, Baker did vote for Donald Trump in 2016. Susan, you've done some reporting and writing on this in the New Yorker recently. After all we know about Jim Baker, his view of American alliances, his belief in NATO, the global partnership that he assembled to defeat Saddam Hussein, his willingness to work across the aisle, as we saw in the '86 tax cut bill and other examples. How's he going to vote this year?
Rajiv, imagine asking the same question over and over again for 5 years and getting the same answer, more or less, right? That was the very interesting backdrop to us finishing work on this biography. Jim Baker, as you correctly said, is still a believer in free trade. He's still a believer in alliances. He's still a believer in internationalism. He's still a believer that we should have a competent White House. He's still a believer that if Mexico isn't going to pay for the wall, you shouldn't say that Mexico is going to pay for the wall. He still thinks it's a really good policy never to lie to the press, which was one of his old adages when he was in Washington. And he still thinks that Donald Trump is crazy and nuts, which are the phrases that he used with us. And yet he does appear as though he's probably going to vote for him not once, but twice, and go ahead and cast his ballot again for Trump if he hasn't already voted absentee. It's a paradox and one that Peter and I struggled with because Baker, in many ways that you just outlined, is sort of the un-Trump. And yet I think finally I came to realize, look, if somebody tells you who they are, you have to listen to them. And what Baker said very clearly to Peter and I, and as you can tell, we asked him this question many, many different times over a long period of time and in many different ways as possible. And he made it very clear. I think his final conversation on this subject with Peter, he had once suggested to us maybe he would vote for Biden, and then he walked it back. And he said, no, please don't say I could vote for Biden. I'm still a Republican, even if my party has left me. And I guess in the end, you have to say, look, if you want to understand why more than 40% of the American public next week is going to vote for Donald Trump, and maybe as much as 45% or more, I think Baker's story is instructive. The hostile takeover of the GOP is what's been affected here. So even though there are many Republicans who may find Trump's actions or character distasteful, they have chosen party and a sense that their priorities, whether they're conservative justices like Amy Coney Barrett or other policy priorities, outweigh their previously stated views about what kind of character we should have in the Oval Office. It's a story about power, right? It's not a celebration of it.
How do you think that view, or put differently, that approach? It's not just Baker, right? You've got many members of the U.S. Senate, Republicans, who might privately say, to ex-members, they say to guys like Jeff Flake all the time how much they kind of detest Trump, but nonetheless kind of march lockstep with him. Should Trump lose and there be what people expect to be some kind of inevitable civil war in the Republican Party, what's the impact of people like Jim Baker and others having lined up for Trump? How does that affect? What does that say about the future of the party?
Well, that's a great question. I think that actually, look, Baker is 90 years old, right? So how much he's going to play a role in this at this point is an open question. But I do think that goes to some of the reason why. In other words, Baker learned from a lifetime of power that you standing on the outside throwing bricks gets you nowhere, that you have to be on the inside, even if you're not necessarily always getting what you want. And I think that's where he is. And I think that that's where, people like him might play a role in this future reckoning, if there is one after the election, about where the Republican Party goes. Baker and people like him say, look, we stuck with him and then he lost. If he loses it, then he lost. So let's rethink what we're doing here. And here are some ways we can rethink our Republican Party. We weren't, disloyal. We're party members. And so you got to think about listening to us. I don't know if that would actually happen, but I think that may be what's going through. That'd be the kind of thinking that he has. His instincts are to try to remain inside the tent and shape things to the best extent he can, rather than break away and be a rebel in his view.
Yeah, I got to disagree with that, because it seems to me that the truth is that if there are two scenarios, right? Like, so either Trump is going to be thrown out of office next week and repudiated, in which case it really wasn't a very strong selling point to campaign in 1978 and say, I really stuck by Richard Nixon right to the very end. So, there's that scenario. Or then there's a Trump second term scenario in which you've got to expect that, Trump, who's already very loyalty focused, who's already very, obsessed with, ever more obsequious people around him, that rooting out the remains of this Republican establishment and understanding that there were always these people like Baker who, held their noses and voted for him, but weren't really with the program. You could imagine those people being even further marginalized or purged. So, I think this is the problem with accommodationism historically. It tends not to go very well for the accommodationists, right? That it's very hard to split the difference, and you can't sell your soul just a little bit, right? And it's hard to see that you can fully kind of wash away Trump, and a lot of people will try it. You already saw some of these Republican senators, like Ben Sasse from Nebraska, is a good example. He was overheard in a call to his constituents. I guess it was just a week or two ago, going on about what a horrible person Donald Trump was and this and that. And the other thing, after having voted with Trump the entire time, if Trump loses, of course, they'll all pretend, that they always hated him and, they never really had anything to do with it and whatever. But it's a tough sell, it seems to me.
Let me turn to a question from Candace. She asked, did it seem that Baker ever had any regrets getting someone into power? Were there instances in which they didn't do what he thought should happen or didn't hold to his values?
That's a good question. I think that he would never say it that way, but clearly he was disappointed with George W. Bush's Iraq War. The Iraq War that you covered so well, Rajiv, and wrote about in your excellent book, which everybody should buy after they buy our book. Seriously. Imperial Life in the Emerald City is the best book, absolutely bar none, on Iraq, now going back 20 years. And I think that he was obviously skeptical of the invasion in the first place. He wrote an op-ed before it happened, sort of trying to steer Bush away from it. And I think he obviously led the Iraq study group trying to get him to kind of pull out of it. I don't know if he ever said, I regret putting Bush in office as a result of it, but he definitely broke with Bush 43 over it.
But he played very differently. He approached very differently than, for instance, Brent Scowcroft,
yes,
who was a national security advisor to George H.W. Bush.
And that goes to our previous discussion, actually, about Baker's views about power. I think that's a great illustration of why maybe he's, stuck with the Republican Party in the Trump era, if not with Trump himself. He and Scowcroft had essentially the same view. They thought, for both practical and ideological reasons, invading Iraq was a terrible idea. Scowcroft wrote an op-ed that was very full-throated, and it marked a serious rift with Bush and Bush's close advisors like Condoleezza Rice, who had been a protege of Scowcroft's, and they were furious with him. Baker, interestingly, wrote his own op-ed, but it was worded carefully enough and hedged enough. When Peter went to see President George W. Bush for this book and asked him about it and said, well, what was the difference between Scowcroft's op-ed and Baker's op-ed? Bush said, I didn't even really remember that Baker wrote his own op-ed, which tells you everything, because really Baker was deeply skeptical of the Iraq invasion, but he had this way of always massaging feelings, always putting enough nuance into things, always hedging his bets enough, kind of like he's doing now with Trump, right? He said to us, well, I didn't endorse Trump, I think he's crazy, blah, 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 but privately, I'll vote for him. It's a classic kind of Baker maneuver.
Let me pose a hypothetical. And I know two working journalists don't want to answer hypotheticals, but navigate through this as you'd like. And this calls for sort of taking this moment and as well as his Florida experience. Should we get into another disputed election? Look, you already have plenty of Republicans who've come out and said, look, Trump's nativist language, his cozying up to white supremacists, and the list goes on, sort of disqualifies him in their view. Baker's, as we've talked about, has a different view on all of this. Should Trump, however, let's say, refuse to leave office or fundamentally try to delegitimize the electoral outcome to a point that just is not supported by the facts? Do you see Baker as somebody who will say, all right, well, look, just fight as hard as you can to stay in power because that's power and, this is good for the Republican Party? Or is there a point at which he breaks potentially and stands up for, the stands up for the Constitution and sort of the fundamental norms and values of democratic process.
Yeah, no, I think there are lines that Baker doesn't cross and wouldn't agree if Trump tried to cross them. He's been very, candid with us about where he thinks Trump has, violated norms and violated standards and gone too far. I'll give a story. During the impeachment trial, when President Trump was on trial for trying to get a foreign country to help him against his domestic political foes, I came home one night after having covered the trial that day. I was going through some files late at night just because we were finishing the Baker book, and I was trying to make sure we got all our ducks in a row. And I found this memo that we had obviously copied from the Princeton archive, but we hadn't used it in the book because it hadn't struck us at the time. And the memo was from Baker to the file in 1992 when Bush was running for re-election and losing to Clinton. And the memo says that today 4 Republican congressmen came to the Oval Office and they tried to get Bush and Baker to go to ask Russia for dirt on Bill Clinton. Because you remember, of course, Bill Clinton had been a young man overseas and protesting the Vietnam War and visited Moscow. And Bush and Baker said, no, we don't go to Russia looking for dirt on our domestic foes. We don't ask foreign powers to intervene in our elections. And then, of course, in a classic Baker move, he commits this to writing in a memo and then puts it in a file. So he has, the classic act of self-preservation, right? But I thought it was so interesting because here we are seeing across time 2 different approaches to the same, more or less, scenario. And for Baker, as hard fought as he would make elections, as much of a knife fighter as he was, there were lines beyond which he would not cross. And I think if Trump tries to cross some of those lines, if he feels that he's gone too far, he will say so.
Let me, in the few minutes we have remaining, just a couple of final questions to conclude our evening. This is a personal interest of mine, and that involves tradecraft. Not Baker's trade, well, not Jim Baker's tradecraft, but Peter Baker's tradecraft and Susan Glass.
Wait, we should know no relation, just in case anybody's wondering.
You tonight just filed a piece on the Amy Coney Barrett confirmation for the Times, and you've been doing a zillion book interviews. Susan, you write the letter from Washington for the New Yorker. Prior to your time, and you're on CNN, but prior to that, you were running Politico. Peter, we know how prolific you are from reading the Times. How do you guys manage to write a 690?
No. It's much shorter than that. Don't count the footnotes.
Okay, I won't count the footnotes, but still, I mean, it still goes into the 500s here. Okay, this
500. Okay.
So you guys, don't have slacker day jobs, and yet you've turned out a work of history that some people might just devote full-time years to do. How do you balance all of this?
Well, first of all, it did take 7 years. So it's not like we were at lightning speed here. Look, Peter, as you know, it doesn't sleep very much. So that is definitely a big advantage that he has.
Oh, they may not sleep, but their internet may have fallen asleep. Peter and Susan?
This is Shane from Town Hall. We'll work on getting them back.
Let's work. If we can't get them back, since we're almost at time here, if we get them back, I'll ask a concluding question. But before I turn it back over to Town Hall, I just want to thank Peter and Susan for a wonderful conversation this evening. Thank you all for your attendance. This is a phenomenal book. I realize for many in Seattle, it's a biography about a Republican who served Republican presidents, but it's a valuable work of history that takes us back into a time not long ago when Washington was in a different place. It's highly revelatory and worth the read. They're back. Okay.
Sorry about that.
I was just raving about the book and vamping a little bit.
Oh, well, we'll go away then.
Anyways, I don't have more to add on the subject of how we do it, except that it was a little bit of fun time travel for us to work on it. And I hope maybe it's a little bit of time travel for people to read it, truthfully. It's a different moment.
In closing, share with us your your favorite Baker anecdote. I mean, this is a guy who led a big life. He's likes to hunt, travels the world, wide range of friends, served all these presidents. In your extensive research here, what was your favorite James Baker story?
Favorite one? Well, there's one. I don't know if it's our favorite. Is a favorite. How about that? Where he was running the 1980 campaign for George Bush in the primaries. And he was having trouble with this other person who was working for the campaign. He was running the campaign, but Bush's executive assistant was a woman named Jennifer Fitzgerald.
A name that may mean something to someone.
May mean something to somebody. She had a close relationship of some sort with the future President Bush. But basically, from Baker's point of view, the hassle was that she was kind of, in his view, blocking him and being a difficult personality and taking errors upon herself beyond her station, and he couldn't deal with it. He found her very aggravating and frustrating, but he couldn't ask Bush about it directly. So he asked his wife to do it. He has Susan Baker. His wife calls up George Bush and says, "If you're going to lose Jimmy as your campaign manager if you don't deal with it." And he does. He ends up exiling Jennifer Fitzgerald for a time in order to satisfy Jim Baker. But he couldn't bring himself to confront his friend George Bush because it was just too sensitive. And so his wife did it for him, which I thought was just what I really like about the story is that they told themselves. It wasn't something that they were trying to hide or whatever. They themselves told us that story over dinner one night in Houston. And I just thought that was really fun.
Well, Peter and Susan, thank you so much for taking the time. I was talking about the book while you were frozen online. It's a privilege to have you virtually out here in Seattle. Thanks for writing this book, and thanks for what you guys do day in, day out, and keeping us informed about what's happening in our nation's capital. We will continue to read you guys with great interest, and good luck on the next project.
Great to see you, and thank you to everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
And on behalf of Town Hall, I want to thank Peter, Susan, and Rajiv for being here for this wonderful discussion this evening. And thank you all for tuning in. If you enjoyed this event, you can find many more like it on our website, townhallseattle.org. We hope you'll consider making a donation, as your support will allow us to continue to provide events just like this one. If you are interested in purchasing a copy of Peter and Susan's book, The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III, please use the link on this live stream page to purchase through our friends at Elliott Bay Book Company. And finally, thank you again for being here. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Good night.